The restaurant was loud, filled with the kind of noise that happens when people have too much money and not enough to talk about. It was a Friday night, and the place was packed. Waiters rushed back and forth, carrying heavy trays piled high with fancy food that cost more than most people earned in a day. The smell of expensive wine mixed with the scent of fresh bread and roasted garlic, filling the air. But for Julia, the night was just a long blur of work. Julia was 34 years old, tired, and her feet hurt. She had been working at this place, called the Velvet Note, for 3 years. She was good at her job. She knew exactly when to refill a water glass before the customer noticed it was empty. She knew how to smile politely when someone was rude to her. But mostly, she knew how to disappear. She wanted to be invisible, just someone in the background who served the food and cleared the plates. She moved between the tables, holding a tray high above her head. She was wearing the uniform, a black skirt, a white shirt that was starting to look a bit gray from all the washing, and a dark apron tied tightly around her waist. Her hands were rough. Her nails were cut short because long nails got in the way when she was carrying trays or washing dishes. She looked at her own hands sometimes and hardly recognized them. 10 years ago, her hands had been different. Back then, her fingers were long and smooth, made for pressing down on ivory keys. She used to be a student at the city's best music school. Her teachers had told her she was special. They said she could play things that other people couldn't even understand. She had played in big halls, with people dressed up just to listen to her. But that life felt like a dream from someone else's memory. Life had gotten in the way. Money got tight. Her family needed help. So, she quit school. She sold the keyboard she had in her small apartment. She stopped playing music and started serving people who could afford to pay for the life she lost. Julia stopped at table 12. A man in a shiny blue suit was sitting there, waving his hand in the air like he was trying to catch a fly. "Excuse me," the man said loudly. "Excuse me. This water is warm. I need ice." "I'm so sorry, sir," Julia said. Her voice was soft and tired, but she kept the smile on her face. "I will bring you a fresh glass right away." She took the glass and walked away. She didn't look back. She knew if she looked, she would just see the look on his face, the look that said she was just the help, someone who wasn't worth his time. She went to the bar, put the glass down, and took a deep breath. The bartender, a young guy named Ben, looked at her. "Rough night?" Ben asked as he scooped ice into a new glass. "It's just a night," Julia said. "Same as always." She picked up the glass and headed back to the dining room. As she walked through the crowd, her eyes drifted to the side of the room. That was her favorite spot to look, even though it hurt. There, in a corner where the light was soft and yellow, stood a piano. It was a grand piano, black and shiny. It looked like a piece of art. The owner of the restaurant, Mr. Sterling, loved buying things that looked expensive. He had bought the piano to make the place look fancy. But he didn't care about music. He only cared that people could look at it and say, "Wow, look at that." The piano was closed. The lid was down over the keys, protecting them from the dust and the noise of the restaurant. It looked lonely. Julia felt a sharp pain in her chest when she looked at it. It felt like seeing an old friend locked behind a glass wall, unable to speak. She remembered how it felt to play. She remembered the vibration of the strings under her fingers. She remembered closing her eyes and feeling like she was flying. But now, her fingers were used to gripping trays and scrubbing counters. They had forgotten the music. Sometimes, late at night in her small apartment, she would tap her fingers on the table, pretending to play a song she used to know. But she always stopped quickly. It hurt too much to remember what she had lost. Julia dropped off the ice water at table 12. The man didn't say thank you. He just turned back to his friends and laughed loudly. Julia turned away and walked toward the empty tables in the back section to wipe them down. As she was cleaning, a commotion started near the piano. A group of 4 men had walked in. They were loud, wearing expensive suits and shiny watches. They seemed to have had a lot to drink already. One of them, a tall man with a red face, stumbled away from his table and walked straight toward the grand piano. "Hey, look at this!" the man shouted. "I haven't seen one of these in years." He sat down on the bench. The leather creaked under his weight. He didn't take off his jacket. He didn't roll up his sleeves. He just lifted the heavy lid and let it crash back onto the support stick. Julia froze. She stopped wiping the table. She watched him. The man placed his hands on the keys. He didn't treat them gently. He slapped them. A loud, messy chord rang out through the restaurant. It wasn't music. It was just noise. It was like someone hitting a wall with a hammer. The people nearby winced and covered their ears, but the man laughed. "I'm a regular Mozart," he yelled. His friends laughed with him, clapping their hands and cheering him on. He started banging on the keys again, moving his hands randomly. He had no rhythm. He had no melody. It was just a loud, banging noise that filled the room. Julia felt her hands ball into fists at her sides. It made her angry. That instrument was capable of making the most beautiful sounds in the world. It could make people cry. It could make people feel less alone. And this man was treating it like a toy. The staff looked at each other. They couldn't stop him. He was a customer, and in this restaurant, the customer was always right. Even if they were destroying the atmosphere. Mr. Sterling, the owner, walked out of his office. He heard the noise and frowned. He walked over to the bar, watching the man at the piano. He didn't look angry. He looked happy. He liked that his customers were having a good time. He didn't care that the piano was being abused. He just liked that the place was lively. Julia looked around the room. Most people were trying to ignore the noise. They talked louder to drown out the banging. A few looked annoyed. But no one did anything. The music in Julia's head started to wake up. She remembered a song she used to love. It was a piece by Chopin. It was quiet and sad, full of longing. She closed her eyes for a second and could hear it perfectly. She knew exactly how it should sound. She knew where her fingers should go. She looked at her hands. They were red and dry from washing them with the strong soap the restaurant used in the kitchen. There was a small cut on her thumb from a broken glass earlier in the shift. These were not the hands of a pianist. These were the hands of a worker. The man at the piano hit a long string of low notes, trying to play a dramatic ending, but it just sounded muddy and wrong. He laughed again and slapped his knee. He kept his hands resting on the keys, leaning back to look at his friends for approval. Julia felt a sudden pull in her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a desire to just fix it. She wanted to walk over there, lift his hands off the keys, and show the piano what it was supposed to sound like. She wanted to show the people in the room that music wasn't just loud noise. It was a language. But she didn't move. She knew she couldn't. She was just the waitress. If she interrupted a customer, she would lose her job. She needed this job. She had rent to pay. She had bills to pay. She stood there, holding her rag, listening to the man destroy the silence. She felt invisible. She felt small. The anger inside her was fighting with the sadness. She remembered the feeling of sitting on a bench just like that one, hours every day, practicing until her fingers hurt. She remembered the teacher telling her she had a gift. She realized she had buried that gift so deep that she thought it was dead. But listening to this man, she realized it wasn't dead. It was just sleeping. The man finally stood up, wobbling slightly. "That's enough for tonight," he announced. "I've tired out the crowd." He walked away from the bench, leaving the lid open. The piano sat there, exposed. The keys looked dented and sad. The room went back to its normal noise level, the chatter filling the space where the bad music had been. Julia stood still. She looked at the empty bench. Mr. Sterling was busy talking to a group of women near the entrance. Her manager was in the kitchen arguing with a chef. The section she was in was empty for the moment. She looked down at her rag. She looked at the piano. A thought crossed her mind. It was a crazy thought. It was a dangerous thought. But the urge was stronger than her fear. She didn't want to play a concert. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to touch the keys. She just wanted to hear one real note come out of that instrument. She took a step forward. Then another. Her feet felt heavy, like they were stuck in mud. She left her cleaning rag on a nearby table. She kept her eyes on the bench. It felt like the room was spinning, but she kept walking toward the quiet corner. Julia walked slowly across the carpet. It felt like the longest walk of her life. With every step, her heart beat harder against her ribs. It was not just a fast beat, it was a heavy, thumping sound that she could hear in her ears. Thump. 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 She felt like everyone in the room could hear it too, like a drum announcing that she was doing something she shouldn't. Her hands were shaking. It was not a big shake, but a small tremble that ran from her shoulders all the way to her fingertips. She tried to make them stop by clenching them into fists at her sides, but it didn't work. She felt nervous, more nervous than she had ever been when she was a student playing in a competition. Back then, she was nervous because she wanted to win. Now, she was nervous because she was afraid. She was afraid of losing her job. She was afraid of being embarrassed. She was afraid that her hands had forgotten everything. But mostly, she was afraid of the feeling that was pushing her forward. It felt like a fire inside her chest that wouldn't go out. She knew that if she walked back to her table and picked up her cleaning rag, she would regret it. She would regret it for the rest of her life. She passed a table where a young couple was sitting. They were eating spaghetti and laughing. The woman looked up as Julia walked by. For a second, their eyes met. The woman smiled politely, thinking Julia was coming to fill their water. But Julia kept walking. She didn't have a water pitcher in her hands. She didn't have a tray. She was just walking. The couple watched her go. They saw she was walking toward the piano. The woman whispered something to the man, and they both turned their heads to watch. Julia didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the black bench. It was empty. The rich man who had been banging on the keys was now at the bar, ordering another round of drinks. He was loud and happy, not caring about the noise he had made. Julia reached the corner of the room where the piano sat. The air here felt different. It felt quieter, even though the rest of the restaurant was still noisy. She stopped right in front of the instrument. Up close, it was even more beautiful than it looked from across the room. The black wood was shiny and reflected the lights from the ceiling. It looked perfect. She looked down at her clothes. Her black apron had a stain on the front from a cup of coffee she had spilled earlier. Her white shirt was wrinkled. Her shoes were scuffed. She looked at the piano, and then she looked at herself. She felt out of place. She felt like a mess standing next to something so elegant. I can't do this, she thought to herself. I should go back. Mr. Henderson will fire me. Mr. Henderson was the manager. He was a tall, thin man with a cold face. He didn't like mistakes. He didn't like it when the staff didn't follow the rules. He was standing near the kitchen door right now, checking his watch. Julia looked over her shoulder at him. He was looking down at his clipboard, busy with the orders for the night. Julia took a deep breath. The air smelled like lemon polish from the piano. She turned back to the bench. She reached out with her right hand and touched the wood. It was smooth and cool. It felt grounding. It reminded her of all the hours she had spent in the practice rooms at school, touching the same wood. She slowly sat down. The bench was firm. It creaked a tiny bit under her weight, a small sound in a noisy room. She sat up straight. It was a habit she couldn't break. Years of training told her to sit tall, to have her arms loose, to be ready. She placed her feet on the pedals. The cold metal touched the soles of her shoes. It felt like waking up a part of her body that had been asleep for a long time. She looked at the keys. They were white and clean. They looked inviting. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away a little bit. She couldn't hear the clinking of forks anymore. She couldn't hear the chatter. The only thing she could hear was her own breathing and the voice in her head that said, "Play." Julia looked at her hands again. They hovered over the keys. She saw the redness on her knuckles. She saw the dry skin. It made her sad. But then, she flexed her fingers. They moved. They were still her hands. I will just play one note, she told herself. Just one. To hear how it sounds. Just to fix what that man broke. She didn't know that she was being watched. At the bar, Mr. Henderson looked up from his clipboard. He scanned the room to make sure everything was running smoothly. His eyes went to the tables, then to the waiters, and finally, they stopped at the corner. He frowned. He saw a woman in a waitress uniform sitting at the piano. It took him a second to realize who it was. His face turned red. He stood up straight. He didn't understand why a waitress would be sitting there. It was against the rules. The staff was not supposed to touch the expensive equipment. He started walking toward her. He walked fast, his shoes clicking loudly on the floor. He was going to tell her to get up. He was going to tell her to get back to work. But before he could take more than a few steps, Julia moved. Her right hand went down. She didn't hit the keys. She pressed them. Her middle finger found a C note. It was in the middle of the keyboard. She pressed it firmly. Ping. The sound was clear. It rang out, cutting through the noise of the restaurant like a knife. It was not a bang. It was a pure, musical tone that hung in the air. It was a sound that demanded attention. The noise in the room didn't stop completely, but the people nearby stopped talking. They turned their heads to look. They saw the waitress sitting there. They saw her back, straight and stiff. They saw her hand resting on the keys. Julia heard the note. It was beautiful. It was better than she imagined. The piano was perfectly tuned. The sound vibrated up her arm and into her chest. It felt like an electric shock, but a good one. It woke up her memory. She didn't think about it anymore. She didn't worry about Mr. Henderson. She didn't worry about the stain on her apron. She just let her fingers move. Her hand moved from the single C to a chord. It was a simple chord, a minor. It sounded sad. Then her left hand came in. She started to play a melody she had learned when she was 16. It was a simple song, something a student would learn, but she played it with feeling. She played softly at first. She was testing the waters. She was seeing if the instrument would fight her or if it would listen. The piano listened. Mr. Henderson stopped walking. He was halfway across the room. He heard the music. He was confused. He expected to hear a banging noise, like the man before. He expected to hear a mistake. But he didn't. He heard music. Real music. He stood still, watching. Julia's eyes were closed now. She couldn't look at the room. If she looked, she would get scared again. She needed to be inside the music. She needed to be in the bubble where nothing existed but the sound. As she played, the song changed. It wasn't just a student exercise anymore. She started to add things. She started to add the sadness she felt from working long hours. She added the anger she felt from the rich man who treated the piano like a toy. She added the love she used to have for the music. Her fingers started to move faster. They were not trembling anymore. They were strong. They knew exactly where to go. Her right hand played the high notes, twinkling like stars. Her left hand played the low notes, deep and steady like the earth. The people at the tables near the piano stopped eating. They put down their forks. They stopped talking. "Who is that?" a woman in a red dress whispered. "I think it's the waitress," her date replied. "She plays like that?" the woman asked, surprised. "Yes. Just listen." The music was getting louder. It filled the corner of the room. It was a melody that made you want to lean in and listen. It was not show-off music. It was honest music. It sounded like a story being told without words. Julia's hands moved over the keys. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her fingers knew the way. They remembered the shapes, the jumps, the rhythm. It was like riding a bike. Once you know how, you never really forget. She played a part that was fast and tricky. Her fingers were a blur. But she didn't miss a single note. It was perfect. She felt a tear roll down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't even notice it. She was too busy feeling the music. She felt like she was flying. The tiredness in her legs was gone. The pain in her back was gone. The only thing that existed was the sound and the feeling of the keys under her fingers. She felt free. For the first time in 10 years, she felt like herself. The room was getting quieter. People from the back of the restaurant were standing up to see who was playing. They couldn't see Julia's face, but they could see her posture. She sat straight and tall. She looked like a queen on a throne. Even the bartender, Ben, stopped shaking drinks. He leaned over the bar, listening. He had seen Julia every day for 3 years. He had seen her tired. He had seen her sad. He had never seen her like this. She looked powerful. Mr. Henderson was still standing in the middle of the floor. His mouth was open slightly. He had come over to yell, but now he couldn't speak. He had never heard anything like this in his restaurant before. He looked at the waitress, and for the first time, he didn't see a servant. He saw a musician. He realized he didn't know her at all. Julia played on. She forgot about the time. She forgot about the rules. She just let the music pour out of her. It was a gift she had kept locked inside, and finally, she had let it out. And the piano was singing for her. The music was not just sound anymore. It was a living thing that filled the room. Julia had her eyes closed, but she could see everything in her mind. She was no longer sitting in a corner of a noisy restaurant. She was back in a small room with high ceilings, the kind of room where the air smelled like old wood and dust. She remembered the way the sunlight used to hit the piano keys in her teacher's house. In her mind, the music was painting a picture. It started dark and blue, like the ocean on a cloudy day. The notes were heavy and slow. But then, the song changed. It started to climb higher. The music became lighter, like a bird trying to break free from a cage. That was how Julia felt. For 10 years, she had been in a cage made of bills, hard work, and silence. Tonight, the cage was open. Her fingers moved faster. They danced over the white and black keys. It was amazing to watch. Her hands looked rough and tired when she was holding a tray or a cleaning rag. But now, touching the piano, they looked graceful. They knew exactly what to do. It was like magic. She was playing a song that was very hard. A person who didn't know music might think it sounded easy because it flowed so well, but it was actually full of tricky parts. Her left hand had to play a fast rhythm while her right hand played the melody. They had to work perfectly together. Julia didn't even think about it. Her hands did the work on their own. The people in the restaurant were stunned. The silence that had started near the piano was spreading out like a wave. Table by table, people stopped talking. It wasn't because someone told them to be quiet. They just couldn't talk. The music was too strong. It demanded their attention. A man who had been arguing loudly on his cell phone near the entrance slowly lowered his phone. He forgot about the call he was making. He just stood there and listened. A group of women who were laughing about their vacation plans put their champagne glasses down. They leaned in to hear better. The music was sad, but it was also beautiful. It made people feel things they didn't expect to feel on a Friday night out. It made them think about lost dreams and old friends. It made the rich people in their expensive suits look at their own hands and wonder what they had stopped doing in their lives. Julia's cheeks were wet with tears now. There were 3 tears rolling down her face, dripping off her chin and landing on her black apron. She didn't wipe them away. She couldn't. Her hands were busy. Besides, the tears didn't feel bad. They felt like a release. They were the tears she had been holding back for a decade. She cried for the music school she had to leave. She cried for the grandmother who had passed away and always wanted to hear her play at the big concert hall. She cried for the girl she used to be. She hit a high note that rang out clear and sharp. It sounded like a bell calling out in the night. The whole room seemed to hold its breath at that moment. The sound hung in the air, vibrating, before it slowly faded away. Julia leaned into the piano. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. She was not thinking about the people watching her. She was not thinking about Mr. Henderson, the manager. She was not thinking about getting fired. For these few minutes, she was free. The heavy weight of her life, the rent, the tiredness, the feeling of being invisible was gone. She was just a musician and her instrument. The song moved into a softer part. The volume went down. It became very quiet. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling, but mostly, you could hear the soft, gentle notes coming from the piano. It felt intimate, like Julia was whispering a secret to everyone in the room. People leaned forward in their seats. They didn't want to miss a single note. Mr. Henderson was standing about 10 feet away from her. He had his arms crossed over his chest. He had come over to stop her, to tell her to get back to work, but he hadn't moved. He was stuck. He watched her hands. He saw the way she pressed the pedals with her feet. He saw the look of peace on her face. He had run this restaurant for 20 years. He had hired bands, singers, and guitar players. He had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a performance. This was an outpouring of a soul. He looked at the customers. They were captivated. Even the grumpy man who had complained about the ice water earlier was watching with his mouth slightly open. Mr. Henderson knew that you couldn't buy this kind of atmosphere. He couldn't hire a famous band to make the room feel this way. This was real. And it was happening right in his restaurant, done by a woman he paid minimum wage to serve salads. The song started to build up again. The soft notes got louder. The pace got faster. Julia's hands were flying now. They were a blur of motion. She was playing with passion, with fire. She was putting all her anger and frustration into the keys, but it came out sounding like pure art. It was amazing how the piano could take painful feelings and turn them into something so lovely. She remembered the days when she had to choose between buying food or buying new sheet music. She remembered the nights she spent scrubbing floors while her friends from school were playing on stage. She poured all those memories into the music. It made the sound rich and deep. It wasn't just pretty, it was heavy with emotion. The climax of the song was coming. Julia knew it. Her body tensed up slightly. She took a deep breath and then launched into the most difficult part of the piece. Her fingers had to jump all over the keyboard. They moved with incredible speed. It was dangerous. If she missed one note, the magic would break. But she didn't miss. Bam 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 dum da da. The notes crashed together in a wonderful storm of sound. It was powerful and loud. It filled every corner of the large room. The glasses on the tables rattled slightly from the vibration. It felt like a thunderstorm happening inside the piano. Then, suddenly, the storm stopped. The loud chords ended. Julia transitioned immediately into the final section. It was slow and peaceful. It was the calm after the rain. She played a simple melody, sweet and sorrowful. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. She slowed down. The rhythm became wider, more space between the notes. She played the last chord. It was a deep, full chord that used both of her hands. She pressed the keys firmly and held them down. The sound swelled up and then slowly began to fade. She kept her hands on the keys, letting the vibration go through her arms until the sound was completely gone, until the room was totally silent. Julia opened her eyes. The spell broke instantly. The reality of the situation rushed back in. She heard the hum of the freezer in the kitchen. She saw the bright lights of the restaurant. She felt the hard bench under her legs. She blinked a few times, the tears blurring her vision. She slowly lifted her hands off the keys. They felt stiff now. She pulled them back into her lap and looked at them. They were shaking again, but this time it was because she was scared, not because she was nervous. She looked up and saw the crowd. 50 people were staring at her. The waiters were frozen. The bartenders were staring. Everyone was looking at her. For a second, nobody moved. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Julia's face turned bright red. A wave of panic washed over her. She realized what she had done. She had abandoned her tables. She had touched the expensive instrument. She had made a scene. She was sure she was in huge trouble. "Oh no," she whispered to herself. "Oh no, oh no." She stood up quickly. The bench scraped loudly against the floor, making a screeching noise that made everyone jump. She smoothed her apron nervously. She felt small again. She felt like the waitress, not the musician. She couldn't look at the people's faces. She was too afraid of what she would see. She thought they would be angry. She thought they would be laughing at her for thinking she could play. She felt a lump in her throat so big it hurt to swallow. She just wanted to run away. She wanted to hide. She took a step back, away from the piano, ready to flee to the safety of the kitchen. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. She felt dizzy. She had done something reckless, and now she had to pay the price for it. She hung her head low, looking at the floor, waiting for someone to yell at her, waiting for Mr. Henderson to fire her on the spot. Julia took a step back, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence in the room was heavy, but not the peaceful kind from moments ago. Now, it felt like a weight pressing down on her. She was waiting for the shouting. She was waiting for the manager, Mr. Henderson, to storm over and tell her to leave. She was expecting the customers to laugh or complain that their dinner was interrupted by a member of the staff acting above her station. She turned her body away from the piano, clutching her hands together in front of her apron. She just wanted to become invisible again. She wanted to disappear into the kitchen and scrub dishes for the rest of the night, anything to escape the feeling of 50 pairs of eyes burning into her back. She felt her face burning hot with shame. Why did I do that, she thought. I was stupid. I ruined everything. But then, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of two hands clapping together. Julia flinched slightly, but she didn't look up. She thought maybe it was a sarcastic clap, someone making fun of her. But then, another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet exploded into noise. It wasn't angry noise. It was applause. It started in the front, near the piano, and swept through the room like a wave crashing onto the beach. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was loud and enthusiastic. People were smiling. Some were standing up. A man in a gray suit near the front was actually cheering. Julia stood frozen, her back to the room, completely confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In her mind, she was just a tired waitress who had made a mistake. But these people, they were looking at her like she was a star. Slowly, very slowly, Julia turned around. She lifted her head just enough to see the room through her blurry, tear-filled eyes. The sight made her breath catch in her throat. She saw the grumpy man from table 12, the one who had complained about the ice water. He was clapping. He had a strange look on his face, a look of respect. She saw the woman in the red dress wiping a tear from her eye with a napkin. But the most shocking thing was happening near the back of the room. An older man stood up from his table. He looked to be in his 70s, with thin white hair and a face full of deep lines. He was dressed in a simple but elegant blazer. He moved slowly, using a cane, but he moved with purpose. He didn't look like the other customers. He had an air of authority about him. The people at his table looked at him with surprise, then moved aside to let him pass. This man was Arthur. Arthur wasn't just a customer. He was a legend in the music world, though he had retired years ago. He had been a conductor for the city's biggest symphony orchestra. He had spent his life teaching young musicians how to play with heart. He knew music better than anyone else in the room. He had come to the restaurant tonight expecting a boring meal, but instead, he had heard something that stopped him cold. He walked through the tables, his cane tapping on the floor. The applause quieted down as people realized he was moving. They watched him, wondering what he was doing. Mr. Henderson, the manager, stepped forward, looking nervous. He thought Arthur was going to complain about the disturbance. "Sir," Mr. Henderson said, his voice shaking a little. "I am so sorry about that. My employee, she stepped out of line. I will deal with her immediately. Please, sit back down." Arthur ignored him completely. He didn't even look at the manager. He kept his eyes locked on Julia. He walked past Mr. Henderson, moving closer to the piano where Julia was still standing, trembling. Julia saw him coming. She recognized him. She had seen his picture in books when she was in music school. She felt her knees go weak. This was the last person she wanted to see right now. She felt unworthy. She felt like a fraud. She wanted to run, but her feet were glued to the floor. Arthur stopped right in front of her. He was shorter than she was, but his presence was huge. He looked at her face, seeing the tears, the fear, and the exhaustion. Then he looked at her hands, which were rough and red, clenched tight in front of her. "You," Arthur said. His voice was gravelly but kind. "You have the hands of a laborer, but you play like an angel." Julia didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I'm sorry," she finally whispered. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I know I'm not supposed to touch the piano." Arthur shook his head slowly. "Interruption? You didn't interrupt anything. You saved us. We were drowning in noise and small talk. You gave us something real." Behind him, the room was silent again. Everyone was straining to hear. "I heard you playing 10 years ago," Arthur said softly. "At the conservatory. The recital hall. You played the same piece. I was in the back row. I remember thinking, this girl understands the language of the soul. Then you disappeared. I asked around, but no one knew where you went." Julia stared at him. She couldn't believe it. He remembered her. The great Arthur remembered a student recital from 10 years ago. It felt impossible. "Life got hard," she whispered, tears spilling over again. "I had to work." "I know," Arthur said gently. "Life is hard for many of us. But music is a gift. If you have it, you must use it. It is not yours to keep hidden. It belongs to the world." He reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "Please. Don't stop." Julia looked around the room. She saw the kindness in the customers' eyes. She saw Mr. Henderson standing nearby, looking stunned. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked like he was realizing that he had a treasure working in his kitchen and he didn't even know it. "I haven't practiced," Julia said, her voice cracking. "My hands are rusty. I'm tired." "Perfection is boring," Arthur said, a small smile appearing on his face. "What you just played had more emotion than any perfect performance I have heard in years. It was honest. It was human. And that is what matters." He turned to the room and raised his hand slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, We have been honored tonight. We didn't pay for a show with our dinner, but we got one anyway. And it was worth more than the price of any meal." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. People nodded their heads. Someone whistled quietly. Mr. Henderson stepped up, looking at Julia. His face was different now. The stern, angry look was gone, replaced by something that looked like awe. "Julia," he said. I didn't know." Julia looked down at her feet. "I just wanted to play one note." "You played a symphony," Mr. Henderson said. "I've had that piano for 5 years. No one has ever made it sound like that. Not the professionals I hired. Not the rich guests who think they can play. Only you." Arthur looked at Mr. Henderson. "You would be a fool to let her walk away." Julia felt a strange warmth growing in her chest, pushing away the cold fear. For 10 years, she had felt small. She had felt like she was just a worker, a number on a payroll, a person who served others. She had forgotten that she had value, that she had something inside her that was beautiful. She looked at the piano. It sat there, silent and shiny. It didn't look like a piece of furniture anymore. It looked like a friend waiting for her to return. "Can I?" Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at Mr. Henderson, then at Arthur. "Please," Arthur said, stepping back and gesturing to the bench. "We are all waiting." Julia took a deep breath. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing a little bit of mascara, but she didn't care. She turned back to the bench. She sat down again. The leather felt familiar now. She placed her feet on the pedals. This time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble with fear. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. She didn't play the same sad song. She started to play something else. It was light, it was happy, and it was full of hope. The moment her fingers hit the keys, the tension in the room vanished. It was replaced by a sense of wonder. The diners went back to their food, but the mood had changed completely. They weren't just eating, they were dining with a live soundtrack. People spoke in lower voices, smiling at each other, listening to the music weave through the air. Julia played, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a waitress. She didn't feel tired. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The heavy wooden doors of her past had swung open, and she was finally walking through them. The final notes of the second song hung in the air, soft and fading like the last light of day. Julia let her hands rest on the keys for a moment longer, savoring the feeling. The vibrations under her fingers felt like a heartbeat that had been woken up after a long sleep. She was breathless, but in a good way. It was the kind of breathlessness you feel after a long run when the endorphins finally kick in. She was exhausted, yet she felt more awake than she had in 10 years. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them in her lap. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy or awkward. It was peaceful. It was a silence filled with respect. Julia turned around on the bench. She expected everyone to go back to their meals immediately. She thought the magic would break the second she stopped playing, and they would just become rich customers again. But that didn't happen. People were standing. All over the room, near the bar, at the back tables, and in the booths, people were getting to their feet. They were clapping. It wasn't just a polite clap, it was a roar. A man in a tuxedo whistled loud enough to make the glasses on the table rattle. The woman in the red dress was clapping so hard her palms must have been stinging. They were looking at Julia, but they weren't looking at her apron or her messy hair. They were looking at her with wide, bright eyes. They saw the musician, not the waitress. Julia felt her face turn red again. She stood up, but she didn't know what to do with her hands. Should she bow, should she wave? She felt clumsy. She curtsied a little, a nervous habit from her old school days, and then quickly smoothed her apron. Mr. Henderson, the manager, walked up to the piano. He looked different. The hard lines around his mouth were gone. He actually looked a little bit shaken. He stopped in front of Julia, looking at her as if he had never seen her before in his life. I don't know what to say," Mr. Henderson stammered. He cleared his throat and straightened his jacket, trying to look like the boss again, but his voice wasn't stern. "That was incredible. Julia, I had no idea." Julia looked down at her feet. "I'm sorry if I broke the rules, sir." "Forget the rules," Mr. Henderson said, waving his hand. "Tonight, you broke something much more important. You broke the silence." He paused and looked around the room at the smiling customers. "I haven't seen my guests this happy in years. They usually complain about the food or the service. Tonight, they are talking about the music." From behind Mr. Henderson, Arthur stepped forward. The old conductor was smiling broadly. He tapped his cane on the floor gently to get Julia's attention. He looked at her with a warmth that made her chest feel tight. "You have a gift, my dear," Arthur said, his voice strong and clear. "A gift that is too rare to be hidden away. I have been in this business for 60 years. I can tell when someone is playing notes, and I can tell when someone is bleeding their soul into the music. You were bleeding tonight. It was beautiful." "Thank you," Julia whispered. She felt tears cling her eyes again, but she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. "I just missed it so much." "And the world missed you," Arthur replied. He looked at Mr. Henderson. "Surely, there is a place for her here. Not as a waitress. As an artist." Mr. Henderson looked at the piano, then at Julia. He was thinking about money, of course. He was thinking about how much people would pay to eat dinner while listening to live piano music. He was thinking about the reputation his restaurant would get. But he was also thinking about the music. He had felt it, too. It had touched him just like it touched everyone else. Mr. Henderson hesitated. He looked at Julia's rough hands. "We have a budget. I can't pay you like a famous concert pianist." Julia shook her head quickly. "I don't need a lot. I just want to play. I can still work my shifts. I don't mind." "No," Mr. Henderson said firmly. "I can't have you washing dishes and then playing with hands covered in soap. That won't do." He thought for a moment. "How about this on Friday and Saturday nights, from 7 until close, you play the piano. I will pay you double your waitress wage for those hours. And during the week, you work your normal shifts. Does that sound fair?" Julia's mouth fell open. Double the wage to play the piano, it felt like a dream. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, that sounds more than fair." "Good," Mr. Henderson said. He pulled a clean white handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. "Now, dry your eyes. You have a reputation to build." Julia took the handkerchief with a small smile. "Thank you." Arthur nodded approvingly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound card holder. He took out a card and handed it to Julia. "If you ever want to take lessons again, or if you want to play somewhere bigger, Call me. I still have connections. I meant what I said. You should not be a secret. Julia took the card. It was heavy and cream-colored. It just said his name and a phone number. She held it like it was made of gold. I will, she promised. I really will. Arthur patted her shoulder one last time and turned to leave. The room was buzzing now. People were coming up to Julia, not to complain about water, but to thank her. A young man in a hoodie shook her hand and told her she inspired him to start practicing his guitar again. A grandmother told Julia that her playing reminded her of her late husband. Julia listened to them all, nodding and smiling, feeling a warmth in her heart that had nothing to do with the restaurant temperature. It was strange. For years, she had been invisible. She had walked through crowds carrying heavy trays, and people would look right through her. Now, those same people were looking at her with admiration. She was the same person. She still had the same apron, the same tired face, the same rough hands. But she had shown them a piece of her soul, and that had changed everything. Eventually, the crowd settled down. Mr. Henderson gently reminded Julia that she still had tables to clear, even if she was now the star of the show. She laughed a real, genuine laugh and agreed. She went back to work, but the night felt completely different. As she cleared plates and poured wine, she moved with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She didn't feel like she was carrying a heavy weight on her shoulders. She felt like she was floating. Every time she passed the piano, she let her fingers brush against the smooth wood. It was no longer a symbol of what she had lost. It was a symbol of what she had found. At the end of the night, the last customer left. The staff was tired, but the mood in the room was happy. The busboys were joking around in the kitchen, and the cooks were humming the tunes Julia had played. Julia took off her apron and hung it on her hook. She looked at the piano one last time. It stood alone in the corner, silent and majestic. But it didn't look lonely anymore. It looked ready. It was waiting for Friday. She walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air. The city was loud with sirens and traffic, but it didn't bother her. She felt like she had music playing inside her own head, blocking out the noise. She walked to the bus stop, but she didn't just sit there and stare at the ground like she usually did. She looked up at the stars. She looked at the tall buildings. She saw the world with new eyes. She knew that tomorrow she would have to wake up and go back to her normal life. She still had bills to pay. She still had a small apartment and a difficult schedule. But something had shifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She had a purpose again. She reached into her pocket and touched the card Arthur had given her. She thought about calling him. Maybe she would. Maybe she would start practicing again, seriously this time. Maybe one day she wouldn't just be playing at a restaurant on weekends. Maybe she would play in a concert hall again. The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing. Julia stood up and climbed the steps. She found a seat and sat back, closing her eyes. She could see the keys in her mind. She could feel the music in her fingers. She smiled as the bus drove away, taking her home. For 10 years, she had let the world silence her. She had let the hard parts of life take away her joy. But tonight, she learned that the music never really left her. It was just waiting for her to be brave enough to play it. And now that she had started, she knew she would never stop. The song wasn't over. It was just beginning.